And we're live.
Okay, call the meeting to order. Karen, would you do the roll call, please?
Otis? Yancy?
On the phone?
Greg? Chris?
Here.
Sally?
Present.
Tor?
Here. Here.
Dave? And Richard?
Here. Do we have any amendments to the agenda? I was going to consider and see what you guys thought about moving commissioner comments before the public hearing, so that if there's any comments that the public would like to comment on things that are listed in the commissioner comments. You guys think we need to do that or not? I thought it might be an idea.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
I actually had somebody ask me about speaking on that, and since it's not a public hearing, I encourage them to speak during public comments.
Okay.
I make a motion that we approve the agenda as stated.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay, do we have any amendments to the minutes from last meeting?
There aren't any.
There aren't any? Okay.
No.
So moving on, do we have any public comments that are not related to items appearing on the either public hearings or consent calendar? Please come forward and state your name.
Harold Medallan, representing myself. I have been looking through the new code, and of course I began this by looking at the things that apply to our properties, but there's a lot of things in there that I don't know if you guys sat there and went through that line by line and came up with it, but one thing I noticed, and this was actually pointed out by Sarah Stoner in her comparison of the old code and the new code, but there's no reference to docks or wharfs or floats, any of those things in your code, and that needs to be taken care of. There are extensive references in the 1985 code to those, and they're an important use locally. I don't know what the reason for that oversight is, but the other thing is I thought was really interesting was one of our biggest uses of industrial land along the waterfront is for parking, but parking lots are not allowed in the industrial waterfront under your code. And it goes on and on like that. I notice you have the historical and Main Street District overlays, and you have construction standards, and I'd like to know why this building isn't included in those overlays, since it's right in the middle of the area. I don't know if it's a metal siding or what it is, but we have several properties in those zones that we would like to have excluded from the historical overlay. So, because we don't want to be subject to any design standards that you impose on us. That's just a few things. I don't know, I've been through code revisions before where you go line by line and everybody says, wait a minute, what about this? But it doesn't look to me like that happened at the level of either your commission or at the assembly level. Everybody just rubber stamped it. So I think you need a lot more work on this. And that's all I got. Thank you.
I was just wondering, could I get one clarification? What do you mean do you mean no definition of docks and wharfs?
That's right, yes.
Okay.
There's loading docks, which, loading dock you back the semi up to and the forklift can load pallets in there. There's no definition of docks anywhere in there. So,
Gotcha.
Any more questions, anyone?
Hello, my name's Kathy Reamer, and I'm representing myself.
I'm actually referring to the residential code, and I know you're working on the industrial code right now, so I guess that's why I'm not on part of the agenda. There were a couple items that caught my eye when I was looking through the residential zoning changes, and I just wanted to bring them to your attention. My first question about these two changes is why? What are the problems that are being solved by the change? What are the unintended consequences of these changes? And specifically, I'm referring to manufactured homes being allowed on every residential lot in Petersburg. I'm also referring to the fact that garages are lumped together with warehouses and their restrictions put on their size, the size of how big people's garage can be. Can I ask a question here, or do I just report?
We can attempt to answer a question, but if it's more just stating your point of view on it, and then we can, if we have questions, we can ask and try to answer. Okay?
Okay, well, my first question is why did you make the change to put manufactured homes on all residential lots in Petersburg?
Well,
Just affordable housing, basically is what comes.
the main reason we did it, but we put a tremendous amount of restrictions on, if you read the section on manufactured homes, what they have to look like.
I understand that, but so affordable housing was the reason?
One of them, yeah. That's right.
What's the other one? Tell me what the other ones are, because I need to know because I may not have anything to say.
Mr. Chairman.
Well, yes, no, that was the main reason, was affordable housing. And I had a lot of questions like you did that you presented at the assembly meeting. And, but if you look at the codes for the manufactured houses are a lot stricter than even some of our local building codes. You know, I've done a fair amount of building. And so these aren't the manufactured homes that you're aware of in the past. So I suggest you take a close look at it. It's not going to be the type of thing that you would not want to necessarily have in your neighborhood. I mean, I think if you take a look at some of the ones that are out there right now,
There's one in town.
yeah, I don't know if that one meets the current code or not, or the proposed code or
According to
not.
Liz, it does, yeah.
Okay, yeah, so, but, yeah, that's, I mean, that's why we did it, was because it's hard, it's expensive to build a house here, and time-consuming, and it's kind of the trend in a lot of places down south, too, is to go to more, I don't know whether modular or manufactured houses.
Modular and manufactured are completely different homes.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I live in a modular home.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of information about the difference between modular, manufactured, and stick-built homes. Manufactured homes use the same HUD code requirements for construction that are used for trailers. So mobile homes. They are mobile homes. They're built on a chassis on wheels, and they have the same minimal standards for the actual construction of the home. The HUD code, federal building code, supersedes the state and local building codes, meaning that HUD homes have to be allowed in communities, even though they don't meet the stricter standards of the international code, which is what most places generally base their building code on. The HUD code has lower building standards than the international. I just said that. Okay. Communities must allot spaces for HUD homes. However, not all residential lots have to have a HUD code, have to have a home built by HUD standards on their home. But they do have to have your code. They have to be built to whatever Petersburg defines as their code, and that code is generally based on the international code. They have to be built on a foundation and have all the restrictions that I can't tell you about right now. But my husband and I travel in the winter for a couple months, and we've seen very many very lovely manufactured home neighborhoods. and they are. They're affordable housing. However, the manufactured homes that we've seen are in manufactured home neighborhoods. And there's a couple of reasons I think that other communities have followed this. One of them is, so in order to get funding, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac funding for manufactured homes, they have to meet the HUD code standards. And if a manufactured home is moved onto a lot and somebody decides to build a deck on it or put a roof on it to keep the snow from falling off or whatever, it will lose its HUD code standard. So it won't meet the standards for, it won't and never will meet the codes for the International Standard Code, or the codes we have for our building codes in Petersburg, and they will no longer meet the HUD code standards either. So you will have homes on residential, plain residential building lots that don't meet any any standards or codes. So it means that if a person, so say a person wants to sell their HUD code home, they go to the bank, they want to get money, and they have to get an appraiser, and the appraiser looks at all the comparables in the neighborhood. And for any home, that's all they have to do to get the amount, give the amount to the bank that the home is worth. But with a HUD code home, they have to be appraised by a HUD code appraiser, and they look at the comparables around town, and they also look to see if the home still has its HUD code. So if somebody's built a roof, an extension, anything that depends on the home for any of its stability, it will lose its HUD code, and you can't get it back. So once it's gone, it's gone. It's HUD compliance, I mean. So if you have a home on a residential lot, say across the street from me, and it's lost its HUD compliance, when it goes up for sale, it probably won't get top dollar. And when you have homes around neighborhoods that aren't getting top dollar, then that means the rest of the homes in the neighborhood's value is going to go down too. Manufactured homes generally depreciate rather than appreciate, like modular and stick-built houses. Property tax is the only reliable and dependable source of income for this community. Homes that depreciate in value decrease the value of the homes around them. Like many Petersburg home and property owners, my greatest investment is in my home. I don't think it's right that the borough should put a standard in place that has the potential of reducing the value of my property. And I think it's not in the best interest of the borough to have properties decrease in value, because that is where you guys get your money. And if you can't get as much property tax, then you're not going to, then you'll have fewer funds. I really agree that all communities need affordable housing. My mouth's really dry. I encourage you to look at housing values around the state. Petersburg has some of the least expensive houses in our region. Manufactured, I have two suggestions for you guys to think about. One is allowing manufactured homes on properties, on all residential lots, with a variance. So that way the neighbors in the area can make the decision about whether or not they want to have a manufactured home in their neighborhood. The second suggestion I have is for you to develop city property and sell it at a minimal cost to a buyer and designate it as a neighborhood for manufactured homes specifically. It would be great if people had the option of an affordable home on affordable land in a neighborhood that allows for manufactured homes built to HUD standards that were approved in 1976. This is how I believe other communities handle this same situation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Do we have any additional comments? Yeah. Okay.
I'm Dave Tinas. I'm representing myself and my sister and her family. Coming into this late in the game here, I apologize for my ignorance, but I have one question for you to begin with, just for my own knowledge. On light industrial proposed zoning, is residential dwellings, are they permitted on that?
Yes.
Is there any restriction on the square footage?
No.
Okay. We have property out at 6.5 Miles, Narrows Edge subdivision. Right now we're zoned as general industrial. And I would like the zoning, if at all possible, to be placed in the light industrial, if possible, if that's considered, if you're considering rezoning that area. It's the uplands. We don't have any waterfront, no tidelands or anything like that. So if when we bought the property, we obtained the variance, I think, or conditional use to build residential, of course. And I'm not sure if that's a consideration, but I just wanted to voice those views to you.
If you could send in a letter stating that, we're going to, after we go through the code, we're going to come back and revisit the map again.
Okay.
And at that time, we can take that up.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds good. I think light industrial would be really good for me personally as a fisherman. That way I'd have my, be able to store my fishing gear there, warehouse or whatnot, and still have my residence in the same property.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would encourage you to, after we're done looking at the code again, make sure that that is in fact what you want, and then
Okay.
make your suggestion at that time.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Any further public comments? Hearing none, we'll move on. We have nothing on the consent calendar, so let's move to public hearing items. We have an industrial classification zoning code, industrial code review. So, do you have we'll open the public hearing on that. Do we have anybody who wants to testify on the public hearing on the industrial code? Please come up, state your name.
Good morning. My name is John Murgis. I represent Island Ventures LLC, doing business as Petersburg Marine. And just a real brief comment. I'm just quickly trying to study everything here. Thank you for trying to clarify stuff. Economic conditions in Petersburg are changing as rapidly as the climate. None of us know exactly what the future holds. Please continue to, please realize that industrial property owners need a lot of latitude. And I think that sums it up. Thanks for all the work you're putting into this. I've got a boat on the ramp, so I'm not going to be able to sit through your meeting. And I was pretty comfortable with the latitude that was offered in the original general industrial zoning, so I hope you can retain at least that amount in your new plan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
I'm Tracy Reed. I'm here representing myself and my brother. We live at 648 Mickoff Highway. We built a house 20 years ago out there on general industrial property. My question is, if we don't switch to light industrial, will my brother be able to build a house out there that's over 1,000 square feet? And my house is way over 1,000 square feet. If it burned down, and we kept it general industrial, would we be able to rebuild? Or would we have to stay within the limits of a Watchman shack?
I can probably answer right now as far as being able to rebuild. Liz, I believe there's some restrictions on it, but they can rebuild. Is that correct?
There's not, you can rebuild to the same size.
You can rebuild? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but building a new structure, you would not be able to under the current way code is. But we're going to be revisiting part of that. That's part of what we're going to be discussing.
Okay. But if we do write in and we do switch all 3 of our lots to light industrial, we would be able to build homes on.
The way the code is now, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
I think you guys have a serious problem with splitting our I-1 industrial zone under the original code up into 3 different conflicting industrial zonings. I don't understand any reason for it. Waterfront land that is industrial zoned is at a premium for waterfront uses. Then, on the other hand, you've proven with the community cold storage that by sticking it as far as possible from the water on that industrial lot, that cold storage isn't necessarily a waterfront use. I think you should just go back to having one zone. I'm well traveled in southeast Alaska. I've lived and worked for long periods of time in half a dozen of the villages. I haven't been to Hyder, I haven't been to Cluck-One, but that's it. And the typical use is very industrial. Those towns have the Alaskan character. There are a lot of people who complain if someone parks an RV on their neighbor parks an RV on their property and they live in residential zones and they fight. But some of the best neighbors I've had have been in industrial zoned, and there's a lot of people that are perfectly content to live on industrial zoned property, and your code throws all that into question. When I read through the latest comprehensive plan, I don't have it right with me, but I did send an email. It talks about strengthening the grandfather clause in the code, and your code doesn't do that. It's pretty frightening when you read your new code about if the property is damaged to the point of 50% of the value, it can't be recreated and so on. You need to completely revise that chapter to let everyone know that they can do what they want to do with their property. Under the 1985 code, a conditional use is considered a conforming use. There's nothing like that in the new code. Any homes on industrial property under conditional uses should be considered conforming uses, but your new code changes them into non-conforming uses. So I think the whole thing needs to be carefully revisited. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further comments, testimony? Hearing none, we'll close the public hearing. Discussion?
Could we, oh yeah, I guess it's on the agenda. I'd like to address some of Kathy Ringer's comments.
Okay.
I can wait until after we talk about industrial.
Do we have any other suggestions from the commissioners on industrial?
Well, I appreciate what Liz, what she put forward here. I agree with Harold that when we reread it, there's no references to docks and wharfs, and she addresses it on it where she says, I think that's something we should address. We should at least spell it out so people aren't confused about whether they can put in a dock or a wharf, particularly in an industrial waterfront property, because I'd assume that'd be one of the uses that would be there. So I'd propose that we would make those be permitted uses under both light industrial and general industrial. The the other change that I'd like to hear, I mean, you can basically do everything in industrial property now that you used to be able to do. And there's no real restrictions except on residences, boarding houses, hotels, and at least our thought when we were developing the code on that was that if you have a hotel right next to somebody that has a sawmill, it's a prescription for a lot of conflicts. And as a commissioner, over the 5 years I've been on planning and zoning, that's been the majority of the things outside of small variances that we've had to deal with, which is, you know, somebody having industrial use right next to somebody's residence. And our thought at the time, and I understand now that it's created quite a bit of consternation, is we tried to separate out the areas in town that had primarily developed as what we're calling C2 or light industrial. In other words, where people built houses on it and had activities there, but they weren't things that rose to the level of a rock pit, a rock crusher, basically something that make a lot of noise, or be in, you know, something that if somebody was living in a house next to you, you might not want to live next to. So that's why we created the light industrial classification and then the general industrial classification. And then I understand people's concerns that they're on an industrial piece of property and they have a house there and burns down, not being able to build it back. So I think we just need to, I think we also need to, and I would make a proposal that we just state right now that whatever is constructed, whatever is there on an industrial piece of property, if it burns down, it gets damaged, it can be replaced, and just put it in simple English like that, without any of the restrictions of the 25%, the 50%, as it exists in the code right now, so that everybody's clear in town. Future planning and zoning boards say, if I got a house and I still want to keep it on industrial property, and it burns down, or we have a tsunami or an earthquake or whatever happens to it, I can rebuild without any questions asked. I think that's the other thing that I've heard a lot of concern about.
Dave, would that stay with the original owner if they sold? Would the grandfather continue?
Yeah, I would assume so. So if somebody had a house there, they sold it to somebody else, and there's a house there, then yeah, it burns down, then it wouldn't matter who owned it. You know, it would just stay with the property. So essentially, whatever's built now would just be grandfathered in. I mean, that's how it should
I think
work.
we need to really state that.
Yeah. And it's confusing right now in the code, and I understand it's there in the code right now, but it's confusing. And I think it'd be a lot clearer if you just said, hey, you got a house, it's a 3,000 square foot house, it burns down, you can rebuild a 3,000 square foot house. It's grandfathered in. That doesn't necessarily mean you can build a 10,000 square foot house. But, you know, and then we should also, I think, also give a little bit more latitude in industrial for I think it was Christian Dupree, or no, that's a different one, but, you know, where they have a large industrial lot, it's like 35 acres, you know, I think we need to, I think we need to have ability to give conditional use permits on larger lots. The question of whether we should just...
It's Karin.
Yeah, Karin. Right.
Yeah.
I kind of think the big thing that we're seeing right now, too, is that there's a big request for residential and industrial. And the code, the way it's been written in the past here, states that residential is allowed, as you know, they've been using the caretaker dwelling, but it's supposed to be subordinate to the industrial use. We're not in this right now. So consequently, I think there's a request for that. The problem, I think, is the caretaker dwelling has become a really confusing point. And I frankly think we should strike the caretaker dwelling completely out of the code and replace it with special use standards on residential within the industrial code. Because that way there's, residential's allowed, but there's special use standards, and you have to meet certain requirements to be able to have residential use on industrial. Primarily, that would be something to the effect that, well, these are my thoughts, and I would like input on them, that you can have residential use, but you need to have some sort of commercial or industrial use on the property to start with. And if you want to have larger amounts of residential use, you probably should have a large commercial or industrial use. So we could start with saying, like, if you have something up to 1,000 square feet, you have to have some commercial or industrial use. Don't specify size. If you want to go larger than that, you have to have a commercial or industrial use of equal or larger size on the property. That's my thoughts, but what do you guys think on the commission? And right now, we're not voting on any of this. We're just throwing comments out. So right now, it's just us talking about it. But think about it, and the people in the community think about it, and please write in your comments of what you think of these ideas. So that way we can get a discourse going. At our next meeting, we can actually discuss more of it, and, you know. But I'm just trying to get ideas. So what do you guys think on the commission?
I really like that idea of striking the caretaker dwelling.
Yeah, it's caused a lot of confusion in the past.
And the other thing I think people really do want to be able to build a residential house on industrial, but maybe it seems like there hasn't been this. They're not fully aware that, hey, you may have a sawmill open up next.
I can understand people who are self-employed wanting to live where they work and wanting to be able to have an industrial use on the same property they live on. So I get that. And I think this way might be a way to make that work, but you've got to have something. Our big concern that was brought up in the discussions we had writing the code was the fact that there was concern of people taking industrial property and making it by default residential by building a house on it. So, you know, and then not having any industrial use. So I think what we kind of are looking at here is, you know, wanting to be able to keep some commercial industrial use. And if you read the code, a net shed or warehouse counts as a commercial or industrial use. So as long as you build a net shed that's 2,500 square feet, you can build a 2,500 square foot house. So that's something to think about.
Boat storage counts.
Boat storage, anything that's a storage, it's in here in the industrial uses. So
the size limits wouldn't be that difficult.
Warehouse, boathouse, net house, or shop counts as an industrial use. So,
yeah, but if someone moves in 10 boats and they have to cover 1,000 square feet and they build a warehouse and move the boats out, I don't know. That could be an issue if you count boats.
well, it's not counting boats. It's if there's a commercial structure there, you know, regardless of what it's being used. Then if somebody in the future wants to move in and move a business into that warehouse is there. So,
well, the reason this all started in the first place was because people came to us and were complaining that there wasn't enough industrial property available in town. I mean, that's where a lot of this started from. They said that they didn't have enough places in town where you could do things that are industrial. And then that's kind of where this all started. And then the way it developed, at least, you know, a couple of years ago when we first started working on this, was the problem that you have like out at Scout Bay, you know, you have a lot of residential houses, but it's on industrial land. So that's why we created the classification of light industrial. Mm-hmm. In other words, which means you can have industrial activities and you can have a residence. The only thing you can't do is, and they're pretty limited really when you get right down to it, you know, the things that you can't do is you can't have a wrecking yard. Basically things that most people would consider to be heavy-duty industrial activities, like sawmills, rock crushers.
Here are the non-permitted ones right there.
A chemical fertilizer, paint product manufacturing, asphalt batch plants, the type of things that, I don't know, personally, I wouldn't want to live next door to you, but that's a personal decision.
And also the things that were written into the light industrial were anything that was highly intensive uses, you had to get a conditional use permit for. So like wood products manufacturing, somebody's moving in a sawmill, you got to put it out and you got to have maybe some conditions on hours of operation and things of that nature so you're not bothering your neighbors. That was what our intent was in creating the light industrial. So.
Right, and then the other reason why we created light industrial was not to be restrictive, but was to allow people that had residence there to continue to have residence there and continue to do industrial activities. And then if their industrial activities rose to the level where they wanted to put in a chemical manufacturing plant there, then they'd have to go through and get a conditional use permit and go through the planning and zoning process. So basically, we were seeing this as a way to reduce conflicts and state, okay, if you want industrial property, you got to do, it's there to do industrial things on. And if you want to have residential property, then, we need to rezone it. We need to make it L1, or C2, as in the old code it was, so that you could continue to have a residence there. I mean, that was our thinking in that. And that was, at the time, a result of people in the community coming to us and saying, hey, we need more industrial property in town. And that's kind of where this all developed. But if people in town don't want to have any restrictions on their property, then shoot, we could just get rid of zoning altogether. But that creates another set of problems. That's it. They're trying to reach an in-between point.
Yeah, Liz?
Liz has a...
Liz?
Just a quick thought is, you might be, I understand, I know where we came from and why you guys are talking about it, but I think moving forward, you kind of have an option before you that I think addresses everyone's concern, which is basically put the residential under conditional use back into the general industrial, so you get it back to where it was. We have the definition now for a caretaker dwelling, so no one can really bypass the conditional use permit process, which was what was happening before. People were basically building residences, calling them caretaker dwellings, and not going through that conditional use process. But I think what you're hearing is we want the residential use on the industrial. We're okay with the conditional use permit aspect of it, and we don't want to have to get a permit to do any of the industrial uses that we had previously, right, which is what that light industrial created. So, you can go down the road of creating the special use standards for residential, but really at that point, all you're doing is forcing someone to have equal residential and industrial. And in most cases, I think people usually have primary use as a residential and then various occasional uses of industrial on those properties. And they, it's not always a set use, because they might have, for a few years, they might do some processing, they might do a sawmill. I just don't think that having that 50-50 split really is going to address the flexibility that I think people are asking for. It just adds a layer that, and a standard that I don't think folks are going to be able to meet very readily. Not to mention the whole enforcement issue of how we're going to define what that 50% really is. So, I understand what you're saying in principle, but when it comes to in practice, it may be difficult to get there.
Dave?
I have a tendency to agree with Liz. I think we just need to strike the caretaker dwelling, and if you want to put a residential use in an industrial property, the current zoning requires you to get a conditional use permit. And that's
actually, I didn't say that, actually.
You did?
What I said.
Okay.
I said you can keep your caretaker dwelling in there. So if you have an industrial use, right, and you want to have a 1,000 square foot caretaker dwelling, then you don't really need to get a conditional use permit.
Okay.
But if what you're really doing is putting a residence, and it's something that you're going to have either as their primary use, then you get the conditional use permit.
Right, because our purpose was trying to minimize the amount of time people had to go through the planning and zoning process when we redid this code. mean, and that was one of the things that we were trying to do. So yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, so if you have a 1,000 square foot caretaker dwelling, fine. If you want anything else, it's a conditional use.
Yeah.
I mean, seems to
makes
be what
sense.
everybody in the community wants, and that's really no different than what we have right now, is it?
Well, in the caretaker dwelling, you do need to have, an established accessory use, but as you said, storage and warehousing is considered an industrial use, so you would be, if you had that established, then you could do the 1,000-foot caretaker dwelling, square foot caretaker dwelling, without any kind of permitting. If you're going to do in excess of that, or if you don't have an industrial use established on that property, you're just going to do a residence, then you would go through the conditional use process, which is what we have now. But I think the issue was people were just using the caretaker and really just building a residence as their primary use there.
And I think that also helps, like, comments were that we don't have enough industrial lots here. And so, yeah, if someone wants to use it as in, like, caretaker dwelling, then they're welcome to do that. But if they do want to build a house, then we, basically remind them of the purpose of industrial is that,
Right.
we need industrial lots here for people that want to do industry.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Chair?
Dave?
Liz and Joe, I got a question.
Sorry, we were conversing,
Yeah, no, I saw that. I didn't mean to break it up.
Applauding.
Okay. Well, I mean, our concern in this whole process, and I know a lot of people haven't seen this, we were trying to eliminate the amount of times people had to go through this process. So if we had something like that, I mean, then anytime anybody wanted to build a house on an industrial lot, they would have to come and get a conditional use permit through planning and zoning as it exists right now, per our existing code, correct? And if they wanted to build a 1,000 square foot caretaker dwelling, then they would not have to go through the planning and zoning process, correct? Is that easy for you guys to enforce? Is that an easy rule to explain to people when they come to you?
It's easy enough. I mean, the 1,000 square foot is a good, solid number, and it's the living area. It's not going to be, we're not going to look at garages and stuff. We're just looking at 1,000 square foot living area. So, and assuming they have because it's an accessory use, so you have to have that industrial use, storage or whatever that is, along with, and that's I would say a pretty low bar to meet in our town as far as, establishing that you have some kind of storage going on property is not a very high test, right? Because we all have it. So I think that's pretty easy. You have your established storage use or whatever your use is, 1,000 square foot maximum. If you're going over that, then you're going to the conditional use process. So.
Yes,
So is this the time when we can make motions and changes?
I think we just want to take input at this point.
Okay.
And, because I think we need to take input on ideas and then have the community comment about them before we make any motions to change anything. Because I think we need to get feedback. And so I would suggest that we let people think about the comments that have been made and ideas, and maybe throw out some other ideas as well. And it helps us a lot if you can, rather than saying, I don't like that idea, come back and say, well, that idea is okay, but what if we did this instead, or something? Because that helps us kind of come up with a better idea of, okay, what direction we need to go with this. I think it's a lot better if it's constructive, so come up with ideas and bring them to us at the next meeting. I don't know what our timeline's going to be as far as Liz, when are we planning on, are we going to collect more information at the next meeting and then have a public hearing after that, or what's the thoughts?
It's really what you guys want to do. I mean,
Okay.
at what point you feel like you've gotten enough input.
Okay.
I think from my perspective, I'll probably take what I gave you today and maybe simplify a little bit more. Too many lines, perhaps. We can make it a little bit more straightforward, make sure we address the dock issue that Mr. Medallion brought up. I want to clarify that for sure. And I'll take another look at non-conforming uses, current and proposed, and see what we can do there. I would suggest that our current non-conforming use code is not great and not very clear, and it's actually missing text that somehow got left out of the code, which would have been really useful. So I don't see it as adequate right now, but it certainly, what we propose can be less confusing than what it is right now. We can make some clearer statements. So if that's okay for, I think, your April 9th meeting, I can simplify this with the same plan, with the same, C2 is light industrial, GI is the current industrial, right? Okay.
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
And then at the next meeting, we'll be having more time for people to comment and take more input. When do you guys feel we want to start taking action on some of these items? Yes.
I feel comfortable at the April 9th meeting. I won't be here, but I'll be able to call in.
Okay.
And I propose to make a motion pretty much like what we talked about. Essentially keeping industrial property, current classification it is. I like the L1 or the C2 because I think that gives clarity for a lot of people out there that have turned their industrial lots into primarily in residential areas. That if they want to have that assurance going forward, then I propose that our subsequent meeting that everybody that wants to change their classification to L1 or what the old C2 was, and then we do that at that point. So I guess for scheduling, I propose the next meeting we actually give our recommendation on the changes on this, and then put that out to the public, and then anybody that's got any changes to the map.
I would say we need to kind of consolidate a list at least so that the public knows what the changes are going to be at the next meeting, and then they have a chance to comment on them before we vote on them and send it back up to the Borough Assembly. So I think we kind of need to, at the next meeting, nail down what changes we're thinking, and then, but we're not going to do a final vote on recommending till the following meeting after that. So that gives plenty of time for people to comment.
That sounds good.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay?
I would like to, I know it's not in order operations now, but I think if people are here to comment still on the general industrial, maybe they have a better idea of what we're talking about. I'd like to open the public hearing back up now. I know we've closed it, but I feel like
yeah, we can do that.
More comments.
So we'll reopen the public hearing for comments on the general industrial. Please come up and state your name.
Hi, my name's Amber Burrell. I think you kind of answered it. I think a lot of what I've been hearing is people wanting to build a house on industrial land with the other uses, and my thought was if you, I like Liz said about keeping that 1,000 square foot caretaker unit, because there are many places in my life that if somebody decides to come build a big house, it could really affect us. But there are a lot of people that did buy industrial land, like Sarah. She has a sawmill she wants to put in. She's in the process of building a house, but it hasn't got there yet. She owns the land. She's got a purpose for it. So maybe even something like, well, you're grandfathered in at this point, but moving forward, if you buy a piece of industrial property, these are the new rules. You have to have it as, an actual caretaker's unit if it's in industrial. Because if that's what you're trying to do is keep that industrial property moving forward, people that purchase it now know you can't build a 5,000 square foot house on this place. You have to put in some sort of industrial use. That way it keeps people happy that bought it with a purpose now, and then moving forward it kind of streamlines things. But the conditional use permit for a house, I think, accomplishes the same thing. So that's all I would say. I think that was a big one in industrial, is there's a lot of mixed use, and how do you keep everybody happy? So... which will never happen.
Yeah.
Harold Medallion again. representing myself. I want to point out that the residential use of industrial is not a bug, it's a feature. That was part of the original 84 comprehensive plan. And the people in Scow Bay who had been annexed against their will into the town of Petersburg were concerned about they were concerned about being able to use their property as they use it. There was a lot of mixed use out there then. And where you see a lot of those residential uses in Scow Bay pre-exist zoning at all. And so it's not like they bought the property to build a house on it. But some people have bought waterfront property to build a house on that's industrial zoned. And the beauty of industrial zoning and living on industrial zone property, I mean, that's kind of a classic style of Alaska home, is your shop building with an apartment in it upstairs or at one end of it. There's plenty of those uses around, and any little town in southeast you go to is like that. As far as people coming to you guys and complaining about sawmills next door, we had a sawmill on the side of Singley Alley for close to 10 years, and everybody loved it. We never had any complaints. It was a Volkswagen mill, and it was probably a little bit noisy, but not a single complaint, no problems with the city fathers and that. And one thing, I was on P&Z back when we did the 85 zoning, and the whole idea was that if somebody gets a piece of industrial property and builds on it, and that's part of the reason for the conditional use thing, was if you build on this industrial property, don't come complaining to us if an industrial use springs up next door. And that is exactly, so if you guys are worrying about that, all you have to do is say, well, I'm really sorry, but you're on industrial property and this industrial use is legitimate in this zone. I mean, there have been probably some abuses of that. I think the worst case, and I don't know if you guys are aware of the level of disgust in town over the city of Petersburg plunking down that community cold storage right next to Erling Husvik's warehouse, or rental house. You know, there's a lot of knowledge about fish processing and whatnot in town, and everybody says that's the stupidest possible place in that lot to put that. Why didn't they put it out by the water? And it wouldn't have been in the guy's view, and it wouldn't have been right next to his thing with its cheapo design, build, construction, noisy compressors blasting into his house, so he had to spend $30,000 on putting sound deadening in there. Now, probably the reason was because the city's trying to save money and just spend that grant all for the building, didn't want to dig up and put pipe in out there to plumb it out on the end of the film. But probably it wouldn't have cost the $30,000 you spent on sound deadening. And I think about Erling Husvik, just a real decent stand-up guy, and I think about him floating around out in the after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where his ship got sunk and half his shipmates and he got wounded and everything, and I'm sure that as any young guy in that situation, he felt like he was defending his country and doing something. And then I don't think he ever had any idea that years later his town would screw him like they did. I think you guys ought to all be ashamed of yourself that were involved in that decision to put that building next to him. And I was aware at the time it was a big rush deal. I was on the harbor board, and we've got to do this now, and there was no public process involved. Now, I think that if, say, Mr. Husvik had decided to build a cold storage on his property, there would have been a rigorous public process, and there would have been questions raised at planning and zoning about what are we going to do about noise, and what about the neighbor's view and all that. But since the town was doing it, it was different. You just ramrodded it through, and that has been my experience in my entire life in this town, is when you guys are really good about letting us know what our neighbors are doing blocks away on some trivial things, but when they're going to stick a library right next to you, for example, they don't send us notices, or when they're going to put the Boyer Weekend Park on the bridge. We found out about that whole thing when my parents got a core permit notice, because you guys are really bad about doing the public process for public uses. You're good about doing it for private uses, so maybe there needs to be some changes made to the way the public's notified about things that the borough or the city is doing. So, anyway, thanks. Or did you have a Something you want to say there, Dave? Or?
I was in the process, and I fought very hard to move that cold storage farther out there, but we got, basically, the harbor didn't want it out farther. We wanted to have it so it'd be water accessible, but they didn't want to take up that property. But that's a good example. That lot is zoned industrial, right? So that's the problem. If you have an industrial zone lot, that's the type of conflict you run into. Somebody could put a cold storage right there with noisy compressors, and if you've built a 5,000 square foot house right next door on the next lot, that's the classic example of what we're trying to do with zoning, is so that doesn't happen. I understand all the other issues, but that's what we're trying to prevent. So if you have an industrial property and you want to keep an industrial property, guess what? Somebody can put in a cold storage. Somebody can put in a processing facility. Somebody can put in a slaughterhouse. That's what industrial property is, and that's why we created the category of light industrial, was so that people that have residential houses can continue to have residential houses. They can still do, like you said, have mixed uses, but maybe some of the heavy-duty industrial uses like cold storages, sawmills, and I would state we spent well over a year dealing with a sawmill issue on planning and zoning, numerous meetings. So yeah, that's something that's come up in the past recently.
Well, I appreciate that, Dave, and I'm glad to hear that you were in favor of moving that further on the fill. I thought, I don't know how it wound up that way, but I thought that was a very poor location, and I point out that property of Husviks and Madsen's next door was there long before that was zoned industrial, and a little bit of consideration for neighbors is always in order, no matter what your zone is, and I've found most industrial neighbors to be a lot more considerate than the city or the borough or the state, for that matter. Government entities tend to run roughshod over individuals. So anyway, but thanks for the clear.
One other comment is the fact that I think most the other people here were not on planning and zoning at the time that was built.
Oh yeah, and I'm not blaming you personally. No, that's for sure. But it was something that was pushed through in a big hurry because we could get this grant to do it, and it was done without any consideration of neighbors whatsoever. And
some choices were made, but we kind of have to live with what happened now at this point.
Well, as do the neighbors.
Yeah. And the other comment I've got is that the old code, I've got it right here in front of me, when you're talking about conditional uses, which are the residential uses, it says may be permitted.
Yeah, and then when you go to, I realize that, but when you go to the conditional use part of it, you'll notice it says if the conditions are met, the conditional use permit shall be issued. It doesn't say may when you go into the actual conditional use part of it. So, the reason, there's a sound reason for having those conditional uses, and I've seen over the past maybe 10 years, because both my brother and my sister got conditional uses to build on their industrial property.
So there is a lot of ambiguity in the old code, is the thing what I'm saying. Right there you've got a conflict between two sections of the code where one says one thing and one says another, and that's one of the reasons things had to be changed.
Well, I would say what the language means, I'm not a lawyer, but what I would say, if it says it may be issued, that it may be issued. And then when you go to conditional use, when it says shall, it may be issued if they meet the conditions. Then you look at the conditions, they're pretty easy to meet.
Okay.
So then you shall issue it.
And that's a lot of this language that's in this code is not necessarily very clear. And that's one of the things we are trying to fix. And that's hopefully with the process we're going through now, we're going to fix the stuff that we've got in the code and go through and make it work so that it works for everybody and it's very clear and everybody can understand it. But there was reasoning behind what we did, and we did go through this code. We had meetings on each section of the code, and we went through it line by line when we did those.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
And we took comments on the people who were here. So that's where the code that we got came from. A lot of the comments that came in. We made a lot of changes.
So I appreciate it, and I have no animosity toward you guys for this or anything. I want this process to work, and really, truly, I appreciate the time you guys put in. I know what a pain it can be, but I do think that, if we had a little bit more notice, a little bit more effort toward reaching out to the public, it would have been better received. We wouldn't be here on a nice spring day talking about it now, and so.
Well, let's try to maintain a positive attitude moving forward, and try to keep our comments positive and say, hey, these are the ideas I have. Bring those to us, and then we can kind of work to come up with something that's maybe not exactly what everybody wants, but at least is something everybody can live with. Does that sound good to everybody? So,
I think in the end, if we're all dissatisfied with it, it'll probably mean that it's working. So it's the best compromise. So.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Errol.
Dave, any further comments? No. Okay. So, we had under commissioner comments.
So did you close?
We need to close the public hearing. Okay.
Are we going to address the manufactured?
Let's move down to the commissioner comments. We had definitions of manufactured modular homes under non-agenda items. So,
I guess I'm going to have to defer to and ask some questions, because I just got Kathy's letter. It wasn't in our packet, but I heard her comments at the meeting. So I guess I'm totally confused. Pardon?
In your hand.
Yeah, it's in my hand now. So I've just had the ability to read it rather quickly. So I guess my question is, I'm totally confused, Liz, on these different standards and these different definitions. So I don't know.
I have a question as well along those lines. I think it might be able to clarify some things. Liz, our code, what we have in the special use standards, supersedes what the HUD definition is, correct?
It would be in addition to.
It would be in addition to. So they've got to meet the HUD standards and our manufactured dwelling on a single-family lot standards, which is actually quite strict if you read the definitions on here, because we require, except for on medium density residential, that they be 1,000 square feet and basically a double-wide unit. The roof has to be at least a 312 pitch, and it has to be constructed with materials that are standard construction that will be used in a stick frame home. The building materials and the siding and all have to be either wood or wood appearance siding, similar to what would be used on a stick-built home. Garages and carports have to be built to the standards that a stick-built home would require. The insulation and thermal envelope of the house has to meet the same standards as a stick-built home. It has to be put on a permanent foundation, and it has to be placed on the lot similar to, its manufactured home shall be placed on a permanent foundation as approved by the borough building official. So it pretty well has to meet the standards of a stick-built home, is what our code says, which is in addition to what the HUD requirements are. So, Liz?
Yes?
Do you have any further comments on that?
I think I'm going to defer to Joe, since he's more familiar with building code standards. As far as, I'm not sure, was there a question in there, but...
Our standards are, for what is required, since that's in addition to what the HUD standards are, pretty much brings what has to be brought in up to the standards of a stick-built home. Is that correct?
I'm going to defer to Kathy. Can you step up and tell me what standards aren't met?
Well, I don't have a specific standard.
Oh.
I can tell you one reason it doesn't.
Just so I know what question I'm answering.
Yeah, it's because I think where the confusion lies.
HUD standards require that when you build the foundation of the HUD home, it can only support the structure that's on it, right? And so even if you reinforce it with the foundation, the walls, the interior walls and exterior walls can only support a certain load, and the load is what is in the home. So if you build a deck, or if you they used to put those roofs on them, to keep the heat in. If you add any kind of a structure, even if you get a building code for that structure, if that structure puts any extra load on that original frame, it is no longer HUD compliant. So what you're doing is you're just adding to the foundation that you set it on. You are not changing the structure of the home in any way by putting it on that cement foundation, because it doesn't change the interior wall requirements, and it doesn't change the load that you can put on that chassis that the home is on.
Okay.
It isn't the chassis that changes the load for the home. It isn't the chassis or the putting it from the chassis onto the foundation. It's the actual structure of the home. And have you been in a trailer? So they do have a little bit of a different construction on the inside than a regular built home does. And one of the reasons for that is because they need to be able to move down the road on wheels. They're built on a chassis and they're moved on wheels. According to the HUD definition, to keep their HUD definition, or the HUD code or whatever, they can only be moved once, and that's from the manufacturer to the lot they're going to sit on. So, of course, if you're going to put it on the foundation, then it's, going to be compliant, continue to be compliant. But if you're moving it from, say, one area of Petersburg to put it on that foundation, then it loses its HUD compliance as well. And I just... as far as I'm concerned, I think we need I just think the people in neighborhoods where those homes are being built, because they do depreciate in value, I think it's important that the neighbors know that it's going in, I don't think that I'm asking a lot to have it be, they didn't used to be allowed. And for them to not be, there was a reason that they weren't allowed on every residential lot. And so to now say they're going to be allowed, I think is wrong. If you're not going to let every owner of residential property in Petersburg know that those homes can go on the lot. It isn't about the home as much as it is about the process.
Sure.
Yes, Paul.
Yeah, so would you be in favor of then conditional use where someone has to get permission, or would you be fine with them being on rural residential lots? Or what would be the revision to the code?
Well, I don't think that it's up to me. I think it's up to every one of you who have homes in Petersburg. I think that you should be able to make the decision. I think there should be public comment about it. It wasn't even mentioned. I wouldn't have even noticed it if I hadn't have gone through that, And I have property. I have property for sale, and I wouldn't have even known that there were changes to what was allowed on that property if I wouldn't have spent a little bit of time looking at this stuff. I think we all buy our property and build our homes based on the old code, because that's what we know. That's what we know, and that's what we expect. And so for things like that to change without anybody knowing it, I think is not a good idea. And I really do think it's not right, especially because there is the potential of having houses that don't meet our code all the way through, not just the foundation, being placed in residential areas. It can bring the property values down, and people need to know that. I think a conditional use, and I don't know, I know there's two kinds of notifying a variance and a conditional use. If you had to have a conditional use, would all your neighbors be?
Yes.
And you'd have a meeting, and so people
hearing.
could. Yeah. See, something like that, I think would be fine, because it gets by the nobody knowing thing. Mm-hmm. I think if you truly want to have, like you said, the reason that you did that, if you truly want to have affordable housing in Petersburg, that might not be the best way to do it. I think it's fine to have affordable homes, but if you have to buy a expensive lot to put it on, people can't afford that either. And there's one manufactured home in Petersburg. I don't know how it was put on a residential lot because it wasn't supposed to be, but it was, I think, I was told it was a $70,000 home, but the lots out in Bayview are like $95,000 to $100,000. So that to me is not affordable housing. I think if we truly are concerned about affordable housing for people in Petersburg, we need to designate an area. I know then you get in the business of competing with people who want to sell regular property and residential property, but and making truly affordable providing truly affordable options for people. So that's my 2 cents.
So you'd be in favor of having it be a conditional use permit to put it on a low-density, what do we call it?
High density?
Residential?
There's low density, medium density, and high density.
Right, so just basically on low density, or would you want it on medium and high density?
Well, medium density, remember, is the smaller lots in the just above downtown. And that's why there's a standard in there allowing them to be smaller on the medium density because the lots are smaller. That's the only reason that was put in the code.
Right. Those are basically the tiny houses.
Yeah, well,
Which are also a manufactured home.
This is 650 square feet. You can go down, but anything else has to be 1,000 square feet minimum, any other location. Right now, it's allowed on, as I recall, rural residential, low density, medium density, and high density is the way it's in the code. But you'd be in favor of making those conditional use permits instead of...
I think it would solve the problem of alerting neighbors and making sure neighbors knew of the possibility of a reduction in their property values. However, I think if your true purpose was to create low income housing for affordable housing for people, I don't think that's the way to go. I think that you truly need to have affordable property to put the affordable housing on.
Chair Newman.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I agree with you based on your premise that, yeah, we should get input from people. I think conditional use might be the good way to do that. But then we get the flip side of it is people don't want to have any limitation on the property at all. They don't want to have to ask us for permission. And the other factor is with cheap property is as you said, we can't buy a lot and then turn into cheap property because it is competing with private business.
We have a lot of property, though. The city does.
But then if we make it if we make it into residential lots, then it is competing. So it's complicated, I guess is my point. I think that's one avenue, but the other part that's easier for the zoning committee to do is to make affordable housing cheaper to put on lots that are already available. And so I agree that more lots at a cheaper price would be great, but for us, we don't really have the power to do that in the planning and zoning. The thing we have control over is what people can build on those lots. And so that's why we're coming from that angle, I guess.
And then, the whole reason for the other side, well, it goes along with the affordable housing for putting this in was just give people more options. But I think maybe a conditional use permit requirement may be the solution to this problem.
I think it would be a great solution.
I think a conditional use...
I think you'll have fewer people, commenting and upset about this change if you have it be a conditional use permit.
I think we need to make sure, though, when we make a conditional use process, that we retain the special use standards we have in here, because those are rather strict, and that they have to meet the snow loads of stick frame, they have to meet the wind loads of stick frame, they have to meet basically all of our important parts of the building code for making sure they're going to be able to hold up in our climate here.
Well, manufactured homes are built with it in three, there's three different sections, one section of home, I don't even know, categories. So one category of home is stands up to high winds. And one category of home has more insulation. And so those would be probably the ones that people would want to buy for Petersburg. But I have to say that I had to chuckle when I read that, because I don't see a lot, when those hurricanes go through Florida, you don't see a lot of manufactured homes standing on the lots when they're done. So I agree with you that you need to continue, they need to be those high standards. However, I really think that neighbors need to be able to weigh in on about whether or not they want.
I just want to make sure that although if we make a conditional use, it's not going to supplant the standards we have in the code already. So
I would hope so.
That's what I'm trying to make sure of. So.
Is that it?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks for the information.
Oh, close enough.
Joe.
Okay, well, now I know where I'm going. The references that we're making to adding on to these houses and such things, it can't happen. It won't happen. Because they are going to have a pitched roof. You can't add a roof. You can't add a snow roof. You can't add anything to it at that point in time. If you're going to put a porch or a deck on there, it's usually self-supporting, so it's not hanging onto the house.
You don't ever know, but you don't know. I mean,
You do know when you permit it.
We do know.
Okay. And anyway, so those things, these standards that you've put in here pretty much make it that when they build these things, as they do get inspected, they do get HUD inspected, which is probably every bit as stringent as a ICC inspection, maybe not as much. They're more stick-built, the weight they're putting on it, because they're going to have to beef up the floor joists, which they do. They're 2x6 wall construction. The rafters are trusses, which are built to 50-pound snow load, which we accommodate. They have a pitch roof. The manufacturer and the standards you put in here that it'd be a double wide, so it doesn't look like it looks more like a modular. The only thing I can see difference, I know there's differences in that, is maybe it's a modular home built on a frame. Is the whole. I don't know. The homes, the stigma of a trailer has gone away, and these things are not trailers. Maybe if you want to put a single wide on a residential lot, it would have to be a single family mobile home lot. But you look at some of these, they got roof lines, you put a porch on them, it looks like a modular home, which we have a zillion modular homes around town.
so you don't think we should have a conditional?
I'm not going to argue. That might be a way to alleviate a lot of things.
You know,
I'm not going to argue
if you're
that.
going to talk back and forth, it needs to be through the microphone and at the okay of the
I
chair.
just don't. Yeah, I'm not going to get into that now, but that's for the commission to decide. So that's my take on HUD, and then I do get inspection papers. Like I got NEC papers if they're building these things, that it's built to electrical standards and such things. That's
So Joe, so the one manufactured houses in Petersburg currently, did you have an opportunity, did you inspect it at all or take a look at it? Or?
you can't. It comes built, but it was portrayed as a modular.
Okay. Yeah, I guess that's my confusion is modular manufactured. I guess that's my, I mean, do we want to have conditional use permits on modular homes? Well, there's, like you said, I know several right now that are modular. But I understand what Kathy's saying. I guess my concern has been that, and I understand what she's saying, I just don't know whether, what we were trying to do with this code was make it so that people could do things without having to go through planning and zoning. So now, we're talking about adding another conditional use onto this, of being able to do it. So that's preventing people from doing what I've heard a lot of. People want to do what they want to do on their own property. But I understand where she's coming at. I just don't know. I guess. Thank you for explaining that, because I got confused with what she said and what you're saying and what's actually allowed. I mean, so as far as you know, what she was referring to about that if you add a porch on, it no longer being HUD compliant and then not being able to get a loan on it in the future? That's my question.
Yeah,
Do you know anything about that at all?
I'd never heard that, but I can understand why, because if you're going to add a second story or you're going to put a snow roof on the darn thing that
Right.
would add weight to the frame or whatever, that's very possible that could, but these houses are coming complete with it.
But somebody putting a garage on it or putting a porch on it, that wouldn't necessarily, that's my question. I mean, most anybody that builds up here, they want a garage, they want a porch.
And it would be supported on its own, usually.
Right. And you would permit it so it would be supported independent of the, of the manufactured home.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, so then it wouldn't be in danger of not being able to be financed or being able to, okay.
If I'm understanding right, not if they weren't putting any extra load on the framework itself, which usually does. Usually a carport, whatever, would have posts down to the ground. It would be self-supporting.
So any of the current inspectors that come into town, then I mean, I guess that's who I'd have to ask the question of. Are they going to decertify a home as a HUD home if it's had a porch or a
I'd have to look into that. I don't know. That's
I think for clarification is they're building it structurally to maintain so much weight, and so they don't want anything added. So I think as long as it's self-supporting, I don't see why.
Right. Yeah.
That's an issue.
Yeah. Okay. But
these things are usually fairly well built because they're built inside a warehouse by people that are doing the same thing over and over and over again. It's basically an assembly line. It's not trying to build it in the rain, trying to under a tarp and stuff. It's a lot different than building something up here.
Mm-hmm. Any further comments?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to go, if you decide to do the conditional use process for a manufactured home, just a quick reminder that usually conditional use, we look at it as something that is probably just fine for that district. And then in general, it's something that has a higher impact potentially. So then you would try to mitigate it. So usually you're trying to put something that's maybe like a home occupation or some kind of business into a residential area, and so you're addressing the potential impacts of that. Mm-hmm. If you're just putting a house into a residential area, you may find yourself really just debating personal aesthetics and preferences, and I'm not sure, once they meet the standard, there may be just a few things, for you to do aesthetically in terms of what you would require under a conditional use permit. If it's just a matter of notification, then you're notifying people. The likelihood that this is going to have an impact that's really something that is truly substantive that someone could point to. I think that's going to be a difficult burden for the surrounding neighbors to point to. So conditional use may or may not make a difference as far as, from your perspective and the tools that you have, may or may not make a difference in whether the house goes or not. It's more than likely always going to be able to fit into that conditional use standard, because it just doesn't have any impact. Mm-hmm. So the way conditional uses are laid out, it's really leans towards the granting of that permit, as long as they meet that standard. You're not given the option of denying a conditional use if something meets the standard of the conditional use permit, the criteria. Just if you're thinking it's going to be a good tool, that's all I'm trying to throw out there, is go back and look at their criteria of conditional use, and is this really going to be a good tool to use in this case? That's all I'm suggesting. Or do we need to add something else specifically for manufactured homes under conditional use permits, so that you actually have a criteria that you want to consider in these cases?
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Tor.
So you're basically saying we wouldn't have any teeth to deny it, is basically what you're saying? I'm
just saying that you should look at those criteria, and when you apply them to this kind of case where you're really doing a residential use into a residential use, it lends itself to always granting that conditional use permit. And what you're really trying to do with conditional use is mitigate impacts. So I think you're going to be hard-pressed to find those negative impacts when it's a residential into residential. So is that really the best tool, or do we need to add something into that toolbox for you if you really want to be able to address that issue, is all.
Gotcha.
Well, I think at this point, we're taking some discussion on this, and we're not going to take action, but I would love to hear more ideas. So if staff has ideas, or people in the community have ideas of how to address this, I think that this is a time to start thinking about things and put it in at the next meeting so we can have a bit more to discuss, because we're not going to take action on it at this time. But
I just have another question for Joe. So if a person's home, stick-built or modular home, is deemed like they do something to it and it no longer meets the code, you can take action to bring that home back into code, right? Like, say the foundation is rotten and so it doesn't have the proper foundation, so you can lift it up and put a new foundation in, and it will then meet the international standards?
You mean if they're adding on something? Is that
No, I'm talking to my home. If my foundation went out, I could fix my and it no longer met code because it didn't have a foundation. I can fix the foundation and my home will then will meet code, right?
if I'm sure.
Okay. If somebody does something to their home, whether it's with if someone just decides to build something onto a HUD home, and even if they may not tell you about it, and just do it, which never happens, I know, but if they did that, then that home would not be HUD compliant, and it will never comply with international codes. So then you have a home on a lot that doesn't comply to the building standards set out by you.
That's the same on any home, though. If someone built onto an existing home and didn't get a building permit and didn't build it to code, that home doesn't meet code.
You don't get my point. My point is that if my home doesn't meet the international standards, I can fix it. You can't fix a HUD home. Once if someone does that, they can't go back. They can't take it off or change it. Once it's not certified as a HUD home, it's never certified again. You can't recertify a HUD home. So I think that's an important distinction, and especially when it comes to property value. And that's what I'm thinking the main thing around here is. If a person has spent their life savings to invest in their home, they don't want to have several homes all of a sudden pop up around them that that don't meet the same code that their homes meet.
Okay.
So I think that what you're saying, that you're really trying to make it fit, but it's like a square peg in a round hole. It's not going to fit. It's not going, even with all the changes you make. It's a manufactured home, and it's built by different standards than modular homes and stick-built homes, and that's not ever going to change. They deteriorate over time. They depreciate over time. Current manufactured home may not deteriorate as quickly as old trailers did, but they don't gain in value like they do, like stick-built, and they've done a lot of studies about it too. So there are some homes that appreciate, but they appreciate just at a minimal level. So, and you can read all that online. So, any questions about that?
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
So I was just have one quick question, if you don't mind. So I'm not familiar enough. So you're saying once it loses HUD compliance, it can never be International Building Code, and why is that?
It can't. HUD compliance is not International Building Code compliance. They're two different things. HUD supersedes. It's a federal code. So even though it doesn't meet the same standards as what we have for our building code, which is based generally on the International Building Code, we are required to provide space in our communities for HUD standard homes because it's a federal building code. But once it loses that code, just one time is inspected and it's not up to code, then it loses it and you can't get it back. So
do you know any specifics on why a HUD is not compatible on international?
I don't know. There was a law passed in 1976 that actually made certain types of manufactured homes compliant, and I think the reason for the majority of it was to bring homes into places that had been ravaged by storms and where they needed quick housing. So, and I know that it's all that trailers and homes that they weren't built to HUD standards, because the HUD standards are new, but similar homes like trailers have been used as transitional homes because they can be moved because they're on wheels. But I don't know if that answers your question.
Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry. Do you want us to look into HUD compliance and see
Yes.
how one would lose it and what that means? Mm-hmm. Okay.
And if it's, the other thing I was wondering is if there's a way to put some sort of requirement in the code that people, if they do bring one of these in, that they keep it in compliance. Is that possible?
Be hard to enforce.
What?
We don't even do that for our, stick-built.
Well, but I'm saying, is there some way to do that? I don't know, because
Yeah, no, we can look and see.
what have other communities done in this regard? Because I mean, we're not unique.
No,
it's popped
absolutely
up
not.
in numerous places before. So
HUD compliance and also requirement to maintain that HUD compliance?
yeah,
Okay.
if that's even been addressed or how it's been addressed, and because it's a question being asked.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
thoughts? Anyone?
So I'll keep that up for the next meeting and just
Okay.
we'll report back on what we find out.
All right.
No?
Harold McDowell, can I ask a question of you guys? Now, so these manufactured homes are allowed to be allowed in all residential zones, is that correct? Or
Currently, the way the code's put together, let me pull the page back up so I can look at it, because I know there's special use standards they have to meet. And they're permitted, I think, in rural residential, and they, I gotta look at the table here, so just a second. Yeah.
It's on, if you're moving it onto a single-family lot,
Yeah.
then you have to follow the special use standards. If you're moving it into high density, into like a mobile home park, then you don't have to follow the standards that are laid out. So then you can do a single, and we've had that more recently move into a mobile home park where someone had a manufactured home, but it was not one of the double wide ones, and it didn't necessarily meet the standards that we would have for stick-built, but that was brought into an existing park.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm asking is then in any residential zone of the various categories from high, medium, and low density, you could have this under special use standards. Is that right?
You don't need to meet the special use standards if you're moving
high.
into high density,
Gotcha.
because you could have those mobile home parks, so you don't need to meet it, yeah. So we're just looking at the standards for the more traditional neighborhoods, yeah.
So there's no conditional use.
And no special use, yeah.
If you're in a mobile home park, you don't have to meet the standards. But if you're not in a mobile home park, you do have to meet the special use standards, which are listed rather clearly, I think, in the code at this point.
So I'm all in favor of affordable housing, but one thing I noticed, I mean, there are twice as many. The population is approximately what it was now. But it was 25 years ago, and I'd say there's twice as many houses in town and buildings in town. And I look at, I'm all in favor of having affordable housing. I don't know what it's going to take, but between having tiny houses, I think that's a fine idea. But I wonder what's going to happen when you have a bunch of. I'll give an example. My mother has several rental properties, and over the years she always tried to keep her rents low to have stable renters in there, and that worked really good for a lot of years. And then she began having more and more problems with renters and people tearing up houses, and that she never went the Section 8 route. She went just regular renters, but more and more difficulties, the result of which she converted one into a bed and breakfast, and it was so successful compared to renting, because people that stay for 3 nights aren't going to tear a house up as bad as someone that stays for 3 years, and those sort of things, and you don't have to worry about them leaving the fuel tank empty and that kind of thing that you do when you're renting. And so it's really a sad thing for me to see, because I like to see this be an affordable town for everyone who wants to live here. Come to realize that some people, no housing will ever be affordable enough for them. There are people like that. And so I'm wondering what's going to be the end result of this 10 years down the road. Let's say we have a bunch of tiny houses and neighborhoods, and some of them are turned into Airbnb tiny houses, and some turn into Section 8 tiny houses, and there might be kind of a pushback against that. I don't know, but maybe just like under the old zoning, we had single-family mobile home zone lots. Maybe we need to just pull back and just continue to allow manufactured homes and just only high-density residential. I mean, that would be a one way around it. I mean, it would allay a lot of concerns for people that paid huge money for waterfront residential property that somebody's going to, and some people will build something tasteful no matter whatever they do, and some people will build something tasteless no matter how much money they have. So anyway, that's all I had. Just thanks.
Thank you. Any further comments?
No.
All right. I think we talked about a little bit about what our timeline's going to be already, but Liz, do you have any other comments?
No, I mean, we're working at whatever pace you want to work at, as far as I'm concerned, so I don't feel like you should feel
And I
that you
think
need to meet anything, specific, okay?
Okay. And I think kind of we'll gauge things as we go down the road at the next meeting, too. If there's a lot of additional comments that are brought in and such, that we want to take even more time to look at it, we will. But I think it's probably best if we kind of move along, but I don't want to rush things too much either. I want to let people have plenty of time to comment. So our next meeting is scheduled for April 9th at noon. Other than that, do we have a motion to adjourn?
Mr. Chairman, just one clarification question. So for April 9th, you will have the industrial classification and zoning code on the agenda.
Yeah.
You're going to take more comment on that. I'm going to clean up the one that I gave you, right?
Yeah.
You'll also have the information on HUD compliance, and do you want that as a public hearing item, or do you want to keep
Let's put that as a public hearing item as well,
Okay.
yeah.
And then you're planning on, assuming what happens in April, on voting on that industrial classification code in May?
Are we going to vote on it in April or May? What do you guys think?
May.
Hey.
May?
May.
May? Okay.
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 And then one other thing, you were going to look at strengthening the existing non-conforming use code as well, or?
Revising the non-conforming use to put in the additional language that we feel it needs.
Wasn't that just that you can rebuild an existing? Okay, yeah, so it's in there, but we can add a sentence or two to restate the obvious.
Yeah.
Isn't so obvious.
Make it very clear.
Yeah, just make it real clear so that you don't need a lawyer to interpret it.
Well, yeah.
So, was there any other things that we felt needed to be addressed, changed?
Is that adding the lacking original text? You said some of the text was missing in the non-conforming?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
So,
It's really, I thought it was just specifically addressing the reestablishment of a non-conforming use, right? Isn't that what you guys were talking about? That to make sure that there's a statement in there that clearly says that that is what we're intending here. You can reestablish it to the same size.
right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Any other things that we need to have on the agenda next time?
Are we going to have a quorum?
I'll be here.
I won't.
I'll be-
I will.
You'll be in? You'll be here? Okay, so that's
Someone maybe.
maybe. Don't know about Otis.
Yancy? Still there?
Fall asleep?
Yancy? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm still here. I had to take it off you. So I don't think I'll be in, but I can probably call in again.
Okay, so we'd have 2 on the phone, but that, we need to have 4 in the room.
Otis should be back from pounding by then if he's kind of doing
Yeah.
it. I'm not sure.
Yeah, he probably will be back.
By May, he will be.
We're talking by April.
I thought we were going to vote in May.
Yeah, but I think we need to have, well, can we have a meeting if we don't have a quorum, just to take public input? Liz?
You can't have a meeting, you can listen to people, but
You can listen to people.
but you don't have a meeting, yeah. You
Okay.
also have, you actually have another agenda item too, separate from this,
Okay,
scheduled for April, so.
okay. Well, hopefully we have a quorum. If we don't, I guess we'll just take more input. So,
Yeah, at that point, I think you could potentially turn it into just a work session or something like that, and just,
okay,
you know.
I think it's pretty likely I'll be here, but
Okay.
I'm not 100% right.
okay. Yes?
Hi, I'm Ray Olson Jr. And one of the things I was concerned about with that nonconformance is what happens with you, like getting a loan or whatever. What's the bank think about nonconformance when a house is existing? You know, in that category. That's one thing to consider, I would think.
I think the code makes it clear that you can rebuild it.
Right, but what does the bank say about it? You know, I mean, it seems like it leaves it in a gray area that kind of scary, really. But that's one of the concerns I would have about that nonconformance issue.
Yes, please. Liz?
Yeah, occasionally we're asked to do zoning, I don't know how to call it, like determinations. And so people are buying a property, usually it's a commercial or industrial property, and the bank or the title company wants to know that what they're doing is conforming with the zoning, or it can be rebuilt. And so we generally put together a letter saying, you know, they'll have a form where we'll put together a letter saying, you know, these uses are conforming, and then we'll show that these uses are legal non-conforming. And then usually on the form it'll also ask, can it be rebuilt? And we check, yes. And to date, I think I've done 3 or 4 of those. I've never gotten anyone coming back saying, you know, it was denied because it was illegal non-conforming, you know. And so usually what they look at, it, you know, it's legal is the key, and also that it can be rebuilt. So.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Good question.
I make a motion to adjourn.
Do we have a second?
Yes, second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.